Recording in progress. So we're back. We talked about, how we see, why we see. We talked a little bit about different kinds of light there are, different kinds of lights that we basically encounter in our everyday world. We're going to now try and translate those lights into how they behave in CG, so we can get similar results. So before we get started in this whole intensity versus exposure, which I did mention a little bit in the first part of the lecture, let's talk about the Maya's basic lights, and consequently Arnold's basic lights also. Because while they may be found, the directional light, point light, spotlight are Maya only lights, but they do have Arnold attributes. There is a special AI area light, which is different from a Maya area light. It's a little more accurate. The basic Maya light can behave like an Arnold light, but Arnold's area lights behave properly automatically. Let's just put it that way. That's the easiest way to put it. All right. So in our arsenal of lights, we've got a directional light. This is meant to mimic our sun. Notice that the icon has a bunch of parallel arrows. Parallel arrows mean parallel light rays. Parallel light rays means parallel shadows. We've got a point light. This is very similar to kind of a bare light bulb. It's omnidirectional, shines in all directions. Well, and you could say, well, hey, doesn't the sun do that? Wouldn't it make more sense to use a point light? Well, no, not unless we can put our point light like 90 million miles away and make it super intense to behave like the sun. Why waste all that energy and all of that calculation when we can have a light specifically designed to give us the look of the sun? So the point light is an omnidirectional light. Spotlight behaves a lot like a point light, but it has a cone. That cone spreads out the lights, or not the lights, but spreads out the rays in a conical fashion, meaning it goes outward in a cone shape and is more directed. And then the area light, this is designed to look like a large surface or area of light, similar to an open window, a door. One of those, we don't have any in this room since we're using LED strips in the ceiling, but similar to the old fluorescent tube housings that we used to be able to see in buildings, right? They had a bunch of fluorescent tubes in them. That whole housing had basically a reflective surface inside. It had a cover on the outside designed to diffuse the light, so it looked like it was a broad surface of light rather than just a bare light bulb or a spotlight. So this will diffuse light in all directions. It provides a very soft looking light. So these are our basic light types that we're going to be using. All right, now before we get into the specifics of our activity today, let's kind of look over why we choose intensity versus exposure. All right, so you're going to see these two controls for the most part, especially in the Arnold area light. Now, in the Maya lights, you're going to see intensity be the only control, but down under the Arnold section, there is an exposure. So, as I mentioned earlier, light is really a linear effect. Linear means that there are no large gaps or jumps between units. Go from one point to the other pretty much in a linear fashion. Linear being direct line. Real world lights work this way. Now, intensity for a light like this. So I'm going to draw two little quick rough graphs here. So intensity works sort of like this, where you've got down here at the bottom left, you've got 0 intensity, and up top here, you've got, it gets brighter and brighter in small increments. So this is the amount of intensity. Amount of intensity. As it goes to the upper left, it gets brighter. There are no gaps. There are no stops. It is all incremental. Now, for exposure, exposure works a lot like a camera, where you've got big gaps because your intensity is increased to the power of 2 or decreased to the power of 2, which means in order for us to go here and to go up here, we go through a bunch of steps. So for example, our intensity at 0 would start here. And then say over time, it gets here. So poorly drawn, but you get the idea. So we have these big gaps. It'll plateau, and then the intensity will go up. It'll plateau, the intensity will go up. And that's what happens with exposure. As you increase the exposure, it multiplies the intensity. So exponentially increases your intensity by the power of 2. Typically and specifically, it's a set of camera settings like f-stop, which is the size of the camera aperture or opening, and shutter speed. How long does that opening stay open? It stays open to allow more light in. It closes earlier to let less light in. That, with the size of the opening, creates those big steps. Now, in the real world, when you go buy a light bulb, you don't buy a light bulb based on the exposure. Oh yeah, I want a 10x exposure light bulb. No, you buy a light bulb for what are called lumens. Now, granted, you'll see watts at first, but then you will usually see that number of watts equals this amount of brightness, which is usually measured in lumens if you look on the side of a light bulb package. Right, so roughly, a 60-watt light bulb is equivalent to about 800 lumens. A 500-watt light bulb is equivalent to about a 9,500 lumen light. So these are big numbers. The higher the lumen number, the brighter the light. So typical 100-watt light bulb is somewhere around 1,200 lumens. Somewhere around there, 1,200, 1,400, usually about 1,400 lumens. So not quite double the energy, but the idea is this is how we measure brightness. We don't measure it in exposure. In CG, most exposure controls act, as I said, like a multiplier of the intensity. should only be used as a way to increase the overall intensity of a scene. So generally what you do is you set all your lights individually with intensity to get an idea for the amount of energy. Then if your director comes in and goes, hey, you know what, whole scene looks really good, let's bring the whole light level up a little bit. Well, then what you would do is go in, get the lights, and then turn up the exposure on them all at once. And that way you can adjust the entire scene to get brighter, or if it's too bright, lower it a little. That is a really good use for exposure. Now, you get into something like Unreal. Unreal doesn't use lumens, they use candelas, but they still call it intensity. You are still increasing the energy in the light. So students get confused, especially in the beginning. They start cranking up the intensity, they crank up the exposure because they think the intensity should be under 10 or under 1. Now, the intensity numbers are going to be big. Some of the demos I do today, I'm going to start off my intensity at like 100 or 400. So don't let the amount of or the size of the number worry you. So big units, that's going to happen in intensity. All right, does that make sense? Anybody have any questions? Damien, Diamond, Allegra? Tristan makes sense. Elle doesn't have any questions. Marley, Jose, Jasmine, Adrienne is good. Thank you. All right, so just remember, for our class, no exposure. You may run into other classes where they want you to use it, but I'm just trying to give you guys good basic practice. Best practices, as they call it. All right, so let's take a look at, if there are no questions, let's take a look at what we're going to be working on today. So for today, we are dealing with the principles of light: light direction, light intensity, light color, and finally, shadow quality. Are the shadows hard or are they soft? That's the property of the light. Remember, hard shadows equal small light or light far away. Soft shadows equal soft light or light that is closer to the subject. So we supply you guys with a scene. Your job will be to assign the appropriate AI standard surface material to your geometry. We're going to be turning off the specular weight in the AI standard material, and we're going to make the base color value 50% gray, which is 0.5. So first thing, set your project as always. You guys are going to choose which scene you want to do for each light type. There are 4 basic lights. There are going to be 4 basic light directions. The light directions we're working on for today are front light, top light, back light, side light. And each light will have a different light direction. So for example, for the area light, which is the first one you'll do, you have a choice of either front light or top light. Same geometry, same light, but notice the difference in the light quality. Front light makes the shadows go away from the camera. So it looks a lot different than light coming from above, which basically creates a different set of shadows. Now, depending on which scene you choose to do in the area light will determine which one you do in the directional light. So for example, somebody pick one of the area lights, either front or top. Doesn't matter, I'm not going to hold you to it. All right, so we got front there from Jasmine. We got top. So whichever one you choose to do, Jasmine kind of jumped in first. So if you choose to do front light here, you must do the top light for the directional light. And consequently, if you choose to do the top light here, you will do the front light in the directional light. It's got to be the opposite light direction. So that takes you through the first two. Then we get into the point light. So the point light, you have a choice of doing it either from the side or from the back. Now, from the back, same light, not necessarily the same intensity, but notice just changing the direction changes the entire mood of the lighting. So if you choose to do the side light for the point light, you have to do the backlight for the spotlight. If you do the backlight for the point light, you have to do the side light for the spotlight. And notice, yes, the geometry is different because there is a different scene for the spotlight. Why? Because I got bored. So the first exercise is area light. You have a choice of either front light or top light. Whichever direction you do, the next one in the directional light, you choose the opposite. Does that make sense? Good. So at the end, you'll have 4 different lights with 4 different light positions. And your job is to determine, obviously, the direction. So we're telling you front light, but then it's your job to place the light to get it to match the reference. So remember, in each of these exercises, we're dealing with the principles of light, right? So we got direction. Where's it coming from? It's coming from the top. All right, so you put it up top, aim it down at your subject, and then you start adjusting. How bright is it? That's the intensity. Now, when you first start doing this, just because you create the light doesn't mean there's going to be enough intensity. So you may have to give it some intensity to be able to see it to figure out the direction. Then you figure out, is there color? Is it warm? Is it cool? Is it fairly neutral looking? And then shadow quality. Is it hard or soft? Hard, soft, that's going to be determined by how your shadows look in the reference. So same thing with the point light and spotlight. So point light, you choose to do the side, you got to do the back for the spot. If you do the back for the point, you do the side for the spot. Now with the spotlight, when I get in and demo this, we're going to have a couple more controls or a couple of more items on our checklist of lighting. So in addition to light direction, light intensity, light color, shadow quality, we're going to have a couple of other controls that are unique to spotlights only. Now, when you're done all this, you are basically going to get a chance for the 5th part of your exercise, because there are 5 small exercises. You're going to choose one of our scenes to use as your geometry base. You're going to go find a photo reference for the type of composition and lighting you would like to create. So I always recommend film noir makes for a pretty basic, decent reference. Oh, it looks like first part of lecture is done. All right, yes, it is. Awesome, awesome, awesome. Okay. So, film noir. Now, when you're looking for reference, always set your tools size to be large. Because the larger the reference, the easier it is to see. So you can see a lot of this looks like you could do it with a single light. Where's the light direction here? Where from? Yeah, looks like it's coming from the left side because that's where our subject is brighter. So subject gets lit. We got some interesting shadows to the right of the subject. So you want to pick something that you feel comfortable you can do. If you pick something that you're bewildered with, well, that's not really going to help you. You know, like this one. This one's pretty popular with everybody. What kind of light would this be? Yeah, backlight, because it's throwing our subject in silhouette. Same thing here. Light behind the subject, silhouette, perfect. Yeah, you guys got the idea. So the idea is to find a reference that you're interested in doing that you think you can take and recreate using our simple geometry. All right, so I have a couple examples from previous classes here. Here we go, project 2 examples. So there's the famous backlight example everybody likes. So this one's interesting just because of the vanishing point. All done with simple geometry. This one, parallel shadows, parallel light rays. Pretty much easy to see, hey, that looks like a directional light. So this one actually is a spotlight. Have it shine down, little tip of the light on the face. The subject is right here in the foreground, but they really kind of nailed the look and feel of it. Again, simple geometry, simple scene. We don't condone smoking, but film noir, everybody smokes and drinks. Like I said, it's all about the seedier side of humanity, all the vices that humans love. So the only thing I would say here is it probably could use a little more light intensity. But overall, pretty good job. Backlight could be a little brighter, could be a little closer to the backdrop to kind of get that dramatic effect. This one, they actually did a pretty good job getting that whole foreground, midground, background kind of look here. Now you are constrained to using the same render size. How you frame it up, that's up to you. So you get an idea. This would be a really good example for kind of a nice, bright, broad area light. That's an open window, big open source of illumination. This one, you know, put together all the little pieces, kind of get the shadow nailed in. Pretty good job there. Very simple, but yet very effective. So you can put a lot of work into it or very little work, like in this case. Not a lot of work, but it was effective. This one, lots of work, very effective. You can be as creative as you want with it. But hopefully you get the idea of what's possible and you can have fun with it, just like you could with the other one. All right. So when you download the little packet that we give you, you will get this, 3 folders. So you will get a Maya project folder. You'll have 2 scenes in it. You'll have one that says area dir point, which is area directional point light, and then one just for the spotlight. 2 different scenes, utilize it. You'll also get Photoshop templates. And in our Photoshop templates, don't forget, when you open them up, choose the correct reference. All right, so here, if you go under render, there's a group there, just like in the first project. Go under reference images, and you'll see that the area light top is the one that's illuminated first, but you can turn that layer off, and then there's the front. So just make sure you have the right reference and your render matches it. Now, again, as I mentioned, when you go to save in Photoshop, you save as, you want to save it as a template, but you can't really get the template format until you save a copy. Once you do that, then it'll let you save it. You just have to get rid of the word copy and put in the correct naming. And don't forget target options, 24-bit. We're not worried about 32-bit yet. I'm not going to save the original, but here is my targa, all set to go. All right, so you get a bunch of reference images also. We give you EXR reference images, which you can plug right into Arnold, just like you did with Project 1. This will help you kind of match your lighting and the reference. So here we got the area light from the front, from the top. Then we have the directional light from the front, from the top. We got the point light from the back, from the side. And we have the spotlight from the back and from the side. Pay attention to light direction. Side light should give you an immediate idea of where it is. If the shadows are pointing to the right, the light is off to the left. If the shadows point to the left, the light is off to the right, like it was here. From the back, shadows should come toward the camera. So these all can get plugged into Arnold to be used to kind of A and B or compare your render with the reference. Now, when you get the scenes, they are basically stripped of everything but the render camera. So you have to make sure that you assign the AI standard material. And I'll go through that when I do a quick demo. So set your project. You're going to recreate the reference that you've selected. Make sure cast shadows is turned on in all your lights. The only reason I mention this is it should be by default in every light you create, but, and there's always a but when you're dealing with Maya or any other CG program, but you could get a scene from somebody else and they turn shadows off by default in your lights. Even when you create new lights, you can do that. So you want to make sure that your lights are casting shadows. Another thing, you're basically going to have a hard time telling the light direction if shadows are turned off. So each render must be a different basic light, contain a different light direction. Use IPR, that's going to help you. When you use color, keep the value as close to 1 as possible and turn the saturation down to like between 0.2, 0.3. Assign the AI standard material, turn off the specular weight, or else it's going to be shiny. We're not dealing with shiny objects. And make sure the base color is 50% gray or 0.5 in value. This part's really important. Make sure color management is turned on in all of your scenes in Maya. All right, let me show you what goes on if you don't do that. The reason I mention this is because since Maya 2016, I think, when Maya 2016 came out, it was the first time the color management was enabled in Maya. Prior to that, it was turned off. So all scenes created in earlier versions of Maya have color management turned off. Color management allows all the lighting to look correct. It allows the intensities to look correct. All right. So let me kind of resize this. We got everything going on here. Take a quick screen for attendance. All right. So let's bring Arnold up here. So brand new default scene. Whenever you open Maya or create a new scene, you can verify color management by going to Windows, Preferences, or Settings and Preferences, Preferences. On the left side, go to Color Management. It's checked on by default. That means when you create an object, even with the default Maya, Lambert, everything looks pretty natural. It looks like we expect it to. Now, if I turn off color management, notice what happens in my viewport. See how everything got really dark and kind of nasty looking? Today's scenes, I'm telling you up front, I turned color management off just because I want you guys to be aware that if there's a problem, you need to check color management on, because to be honest, most pipelines nowadays expect color management to be turned on. So make sure color management is on. You open your scene and you're getting this, or you bring your renders into Arnold. Oh yeah, let me show you that. Seeing how we can bring our reference in, let's bring a reference image into Arnold with color management turned off. Arnold is basically going to puke. Let's pick this one. No, let's pick a nice bright one. There we go. All right. So that's what it looks like. You say, that's not bad. Okay, well, here's what it looks like with color management turned on. That's what it should look like. So does that make sense? Color management. So verify it needs to be on. Now, for anything that's brand new, if you guys create a new scene right now, color management's turned on, you generally don't have to worry about it. But like I said, if you're getting something from somebody else, you can't always rely on color management being turned on or having the right materials for the job. That is going to be on you. So just verify color management is on. All right. So any questions about color management? Everybody good? Diamond, you good? How about Allegra? Questions? You good? Okay. See, Tristan's good. Adriana's good. Awesome. Thank you. Jose's good. Jasmine's good.
I think one of the students in the last class was having issues with that. I'll probably reach out to them and see if that helps.
Yep. Depends on how old the scene was that he was working on, or if he accidentally turned it off, or what was going on. But yep, that's something you need to watch out for.
Yeah, there was a student whose scenes looked like that. And I couldn't figure out why.
Yep, that might be it. All right, so let's go and actually do a little bit of a demo on what these lights do. So I'm just going to use, you guys can follow along with me if you want. I'm going to use a simple plane and 3 spheres. Kind of like what I did the other day when I was demoing the focal length in the camera. All right, so I'm just going to make a simple polyplane. I'm going to scale it so it takes up the whole grid. I'm going to create a couple of spheres, pull them up off the ground in Y by 1 unit. And let's duplicate them, Control D a couple of times. And there we go. Now, by default, these all have Lambert assigned to them. The initial shading group, Lambert 1. That is Maya's default display material. Nothing wrong with it, but it is not really a physically accurate material. It is 1980s technology at its best. So it's okay, but we are going to be using the AI standard material. That is Arnold. So when you get the scenes, your job is to select all the geometry. You can do it a couple of ways. You can do it in the outliner. Simply select all the geometry there, Shift Select. You can marquee select in the viewport. As long as you get all the geometry, we are going to replace it with the Arnold AI standard surface. Now, there's a couple of ways you can replace the material. Anybody know of any?
Isn't there like a shift? Is it shift right click or just right click? One of them you can go to the bottom and click new material.
So you want to right click and you can go new material. And that brings up the assign new material. So you go down to Arnold, you go down to shader, and you go to the AI standard surface. There's also another way. There's a keyboard shortcut, which is my favorite. It is Shift plus T. Shift plus T, T for tango. All right, so if I do Shift T with everything selected, first I got to select the Maya interface, that helps. Shift T. There we go. Shift T, that brings up the assign new material window, just like right-clicking and going to create new material. So Shift T, you do the same thing, Arnold, shader, AI standard surface. Once I select that, now all my geometry has the AI standard surface assigned to it. Now, when you have the AI standard surface assigned to it, you need to go into the attributes, and there are a couple of things you need to do, which I've got noted here in the instructions. Right? So assign an AI standard surface material to all your geometry. The first thing you do after that is turn off specular weight. Specular weight, this goes off. This takes all the reflectivity out of the material. And now it is a diffuse material. One other thing, Arnold by default has like 0.8 for the weight, which is really light gray. We want to make it so it's 50% gray. So we take the value in the base color and turn it down to 0.5. So here in the attributes, base, color, click on the color swatch. That brings up our color, our basic color palette, and we take the weight, which is the value, and we turn the value down to 0.5. There we go. Now I've already got color management turned on. How do I know? Well, I created a new scene, and color management is enabled already. So again, assign your AI standard surface, turn off specular weight, click inside the color of the base, turn the value down to 0.5. That's 50% gray. And now you're set to go. Now our materials will respond accurately. So let's go and, well, let me quit out of Photoshop because I got Photoshop in Maya, and that's a ticking time bomb. All right, good. Crisis averted. So let's see which light you would like to see first. Directional, point, area, or spotlight. All right, we got one vote for point. Okay, let's go with point. We got 2 votes for point. So a point light, you won't find that in the Arnold shelf. You'll see a couple of lights here. And the only one we're going to be dealing with today is going to be this one, which is an AI area light. But we're going to do a point light first. So a point light, we have to go to the Create menu, to Lights, down to Maya, and do not confuse the point light with the ambient light. The ambient light is a spawn of Satan. That is from the days when there was no global illumination and no bounce lighting. That was Maya's solution, and it was dreadful. We want the point light. Now, the point light will drop in the scene at the center, which is the origin. Everything drops there. Now, you'll notice in the attributes for the point light at the top, you've got your basic point light attributes, which are color and intensity. And then you've got an Arnold rollout toward the bottom. A rollout's kind of like a sub-attribute underneath of the Arnold attributes. So go down and expand the Arnold section of the point light. So now, down in the Arnold section, you'll see there's exposure. So ignore that. We're not dealing with that. We're dealing with, for the most part, color and intensity, and a couple of things down here toward the bottom. This is going to be where we get our shadow quality from. All right, so let's take a look at what this looks like in the default position with the default intensity. So I'm going to open up the Arnold render view. Let's get rid of this. Don't need that. And I don't have an image area in here. Good. So I don't need that. Let's make this a little smaller. All right. So let's just render, see what we get. So I got a yellow warning here. All right. Let me stop that. So something else you need to check in your scene. When you open your scene up, everything is going to have default Lambert in it. You're going to put a new AI standard surface. You also want to make sure that your renderer is set for Arnold. So my renderer is set for Arnold. That's good. Can't always rely on it being there. So why am I not seeing anything? It rendered. Well, that's because my geometry right now is inside or is covering the point light. So let's pull it up a little bit. There we go. So now when I pull it up out of the ground, it's visible. And notice it's really like super dim. So default intensity of 1, probably not enough. So went up to 10. Let's go to 100. There we go. So now it's nice and bright. It covers a lot more area. So you can see my light gets closer to the geometry. The shadows change a little bit, but they don't get softer. They don't get harder. They pretty much remain the same. So I can move my light around anywhere I want. But my shadows remain the same. Now, remember, shadow quality is all about size of the light or relationship to it, meaning if my light is further away, it should be harder. If it's closer, it should be softer. But the point light doesn't behave like that. Why? Because basically it's a Maya dumb light until we make a couple of changes to it. Now, you might say, okay, well, you talked about scale. Big light, small light. So can't we scale it? Okay, well, let's scale it. Nothing's happening. Well, that's because the icon is not changing. The point light is not designed to scale. It is designed to look infinitely small. So how do we make it softer? Well, we go into the attributes, in particular the Arnold attributes, and there's a feature here called radius. Right now, the radius of the light is at 0, which means it's infinitely small. That's why our shadows are razor sharp. So let me zoom in a little bit here in the viewport so we can get a better idea. All right, so there's my shadows, razor sharp. Now watch as I increase my radius a little bit. Notice the edges are starting to soften. Increase it a little more. Now they're much softer. So this radius control allows us to adjust or make that point light appear to be larger than an infinitely small point in space. So remember, by default, you get this kind of shadow. But really, in our reference, we might need something more like this. And honestly, I'm not a big fan of the slider because, you sneeze and you wind up, oh, what happened to it? Now, here's the thing. This is really interesting for me anyway. As you increase it, it makes it bigger, but watch what happens if I increase it past a certain point. Looks like we get a black hole there. Like, what's going on? Okay, here's what's happening under the scenes. And let me make this light small. So we'll just keep in mind right around 4.5, right around 4 and between 4 and 5. We got a black hole in there. So let's make the light visible to the camera. To make the light visible to the camera, we go down in the Arnold section here, and we go down, and right now the visibility to the camera is set at 0. So let's make it visible. Let's turn it on. And let me kind of lower this a little bit so we can see it. Let's stop IPR and start it again. right? So it's infinitely small right now. Let me lower it a little. There we go. So I lowered it a little. I should be able to see it. It's like right over here. But what's going on is it's infinitely small. Let's give it a little bit of a radius, like 0.1. So now it becomes visible. Before it was so small, it was a pin and you couldn't see it. So let's go even smaller, 0.1. There we go. Now it's really tiny. But when I made it really big, watch what happens. I'm actually increasing the size of the light invisibly. And when I get right around 4 or 5, I'm starting to go through the geometry, right around there. So we're actually making the light bigger, but you can't really see it in the icon. All right, so the whole reason I'm going over this is because in addition to light intensity, we've got light color. To change the light color, I can come in here and I can make it, let's say, yellow. All right, well, yellow is great, but that's really too saturated. Turn your saturation level down, and now you've got something that looks more manageable, more realistic. It's basically less saturated. You know, I can change the hue, make it a little more orange. And I can change the hue again and make it a little cooler. You know, I can go into the purples. Purples are like kind of a weird color because it could be both warm and cool at the same time because it's got blues and reds in it. And traditionally, reds are seen as, you know, warm colors. They kind of come toward the camera, whereas cools tend to recede. But you've got a color with both of them in there. And it could sort of be either warm or cool. So color, based on your reference, is it warm? Is it cool? If it's cool, it's probably going to be some shade of blue, possibly green. Although green is used more for an effect, like every zombie hospital you've ever seen in any game has always got green light. You know, it's always designed to look like that fluorescent, kind of sickly, hospital-y, old light. All right, so if you want to get back to your white color, you can just click that. Another way you can get back to white is simply taking the color slider, drag it left, drag it right, and now you've just broken the color. You've reset it back to the default. All right, so it's all about light direction. That's the position of the light. Where is it? It's all about the intensity. It's all about the color. And now the shadow quality, this is where we get into the radius. So remember, the radius for a point light is at 0, which means super hard shadows. How much you need is probably going to be based off your reference, but you want to make sure you don't overdo it, making them too soft, unless your reference is like that. Remember to look at all shadows and compare them. Don't just go by one shadow because one shadow may look harder than the others. All right, there we go. So give it a little bit of softness. That's under radius. Now, to make the light visible to the camera, you go down under visibility, especially if you're doing a film noir, and they've got, a visible light source. And you want to make your light source visible too. Just remember, you can't scale this. This is all done by the radius. The only light you can physically scale is the Arnold area light. That is meant to be scaled to change the shadow quality. All right, so these are the basic parameters for most lights, honestly. You've got your intensity, you've got your color, and then your shadow quality. All right, so light direction, does it come from the side? Does it come from the front? Does it come from the top? Does it come from the back? And it's all about where the camera is, where the subject is, where the light is. Everything is based off of that relationship. When you're looking at the subject, you are in the camera, you're aimed at the subject, and then the light position is based off of that relationship. All right, does that make sense? Any questions on the point light? Remember, point light's omnidirectional. It shines in all directions. You can't really control that. Yes, I was actually showing that, Jasmine. So the shadow radius at 0, let me turn visibility back. So at 0, you can see who has razor sharp shadows. But as I increase the radius, I also made the light visible just so you could see it. But if it were off, as I increase the radius a little bit, now my shadows get harder. Well, let me keep this. And then let's turn this up to right about there. So now you should be able to see the shadow edges are softer. As I increase this more, the shadows get softer. But in the viewport, you can't see any of that. You can only see it in the render view. Does that answer your question, Jasmine? Okay, good. So yes, definitely, the render view is your friend. All right. Any other questions? Good question. Thank you. Let's delete that. Let's stop that. All right. Now, if you delete a light, obviously, you're not going to see anything in the render view. So a lot of times, if you're working with multiple lights, maybe you don't want to delete them immediately, and you kind of want to keep it and compare. Well, you can throw a light onto a layer in your layer editor. Remember, it's channel box layer editor. You guys did this with modeling. Make parts of a model, throw them onto a display layer. You can turn certain parts off, work, turn them back on. Do the same thing with a light. So, layer, select the light, create a new layer. It will add the selected object to the layer. So now, if I turn visibility off and render, it's invisible. Now, if you do that, just make sure that you label your lights. So I got a point light there. Good. All right. Which light should we do next? We've already done the point, so we got directional, spot, or area. Area. I see one vote for area. Griffin says area. All right, let's do area light. This one is an Arnold light. So for this, we go to the Arnold shelf. Right there, the very first icon on the left. If you take a look at the toolbar hint down here at the bottom, I hover above it, it says area light right down here. Create area light. So I click on it. Go into my attribute editor and it says AI area light. Notice we've got intensity and exposure. And again, we don't use exposure. Just forget that exists. So let's render it out, see what we get. The default position, default intensity. Now you'll notice that we get a little bit of light, unlike the point light, which was buried inside the geometry. This has a little tiny part sticking out. So let's pull it up out of the ground. And you'll notice, wow, I can hardly see that. Very, very dim. I'm sorry, what did you say? Right. Well, if I move mine too far away, I don't see it. I got mine like right in front of my geometry. Also, make sure you don't have your layers selected and you accidentally put your brand new area light into your point light layer with everything hidden. Do you see it? Now, obviously, this is due to quite a lack of intensity. So let's crank the intensity up. And again, I'm going to go, let's go like 10. You can see I got a little bit more visibility here, but it's really pretty dark. There we go. Crank it up. I crank it up to like 100. Make sure your area light is pointed at your geometry because it does not show anything behind the light. Now for this, notice that our shadows are pretty soft by default. I haven't even done anything like rotate the light. So for the point light doesn't, rotation has no effect in the point light at all. It's omnidirectional. You can't scale it. You can't rotate it. You can only translate it. For this, translation matters. Rotation matters because now I can aim it. It is like a big flat plane. So let's put it back to the default of 0 rotation just for now. You still having issues, Daya?
No,
Did you get it fixed?
no.
All right, hang on a second. Let me come and look. Okay, I'm back. So area light, as we mentioned. I don't know what's going on with my projector here. All right. So you guys can see my screen okay, right, in Zoom? Just verifying because everything's kind of wigging out here. Okay, yeah, everybody can see? All right, good, thank you. All right, so let me turn that off. Okay. So Arnold, we've got our area light in there. Notice, as I mentioned, that the area light does not broadcast any light behind the subject. Now, unlike the point light, the area light shadow quality is controlled by the actual scale. So if I scale the area light, make it smaller, watch what happens to my shadows. They get harder. Now, as I increase the scale of the light, make it bigger, the shadows get softer. So this is why we call this one the actual physical light. This allows us to scale the light and have the shadows change just like it would in the real world. So we don't have to worry about things like, well, I mean, we have controls like soft edge, but that really doesn't matter for what we're doing. We want to be able to use the light shape and the physicality of it to make stuff smaller or make it larger. And larger and smaller make shadows change. So again, small light equals hard shadows. Big light equals soft shadows. And notice the light doesn't get any brighter the bigger I make it. All right, now light position. This is all about translation and rotation. Now, for this area light, we can also change and make it visible to the camera. So let's just change the default rotations back to 0. I'm going to change the scale back to 1 just to have it as a base reference point. So let's rotate it around a little. Let's lower it just slightly. There we go. Make the shadows longer. The higher up it is, the shadows get shorter. And we can also make this light visible to the camera. So down under visibility, we can make it visible. So if we need to. Now it's really pretty touchy here. It's either off, maybe a little gray, but then that's it. That's visibility right there. Any luck, Daya? What's that? Okay. All right, so we can scale the light, change the shadow quality, make the light brighter. We can rotate it, we can translate it. We can basically have all of the physical features in a light. Translate, rotate, scale, and we can also change the color if needed. So again, color, can add a little bit of warm to it. It's not going to change how the light looks to the camera, but it will change how the rendered objects look to the camera. Make it cool. We can make it warm. We want to get rid of the color. Couple ways to do it. Quickest way, drag the color slider left, drag it right. And now we've taken the color back to the default, white. Right, does that make sense? Any questions on the area light? Tristan's good, thank you. Jasmine's good. Adriana's good, thank you. Griffin's good. Marley, Jose's good, thank you. L's good. All right. So I'm going to take this light and let's throw that on a display layer also, separate one. There we go. That's going to be called my area light. Turn visibility off. Now, back to square one, I got nothing. All right, so we've got a choice of spotlight or directional light. Your choice, which one would you like to see? All right, we got a couple of calls for a spotlight. That's perfectly fine. We can do that. All right, so next light we're going to look at is the spotlight. So to make a spotlight, that's not going to be found in the Arnold shelf. So we go to Create, Lights, down to the Maya standard lights, and we want to go Spot. Now, by default, just going to hit Render. We're not going to see anything because the back of our spotlight, which is really that small point where the cone merges, it's really a point light. In reality, that's being funneled into the shape of a cone. So let me pull this up out of the ground a little bit. And now you should be able to see it dimly. Let me pull it back a little. Should be able to see it dimly in our render. All right, so the scale for this, you can scale it up, but really you're scaling the icon and not the light itself. I'll show you in a second. The control for this light is actually very simple. You can translate it, you can scale it, you can rotate it. You can also use what is called the interactive manipulator. Which is basically the T key with the light selected. So I select the light, hit T as in tango, and now notice I get a little center of interest. It's basically almost like the light is pointed and constrained to that little center of interest. I can drag it all around my scene and notice that the spotlight follows it. Now, in all honesty, I think my spotlight needs to be brighter, so I'm going to increase the intensity. And yeah, I'm going to go to my default, kind of like 100. Interactive manipulator, the T key. You want to get rid of it? Just hit any W, E, or R for translate, rotate, or scale. That gets rid of the manipulator. Hit T again, you're back. So let me pull the light up a little bit. And notice that it's basically the same kind of light that's used if you ever go to see a stage show, watch a comedian walk around the stage. They're always following them with the spotlight. That's pretty much what we got going on here. Now, if I scale this light, watch what happens. Well, nothing. The light doesn't change. The quality of it doesn't change. You're basically just scaling the icon. So scale has no control over this. So I'm going to put my scale back to 1, the default. That's a manageable size compared to my scene. You might want to scale it if you're in a big, gigantic scene and your spotlight is too little, or you're in a little tiny scene and your spotlight's too big. You can scale it to make it so it's sort of manageable with everything else that's going on. Now, we've got basic light properties. We've got intensity. We've got light direction, which we can control with this interactive manipulator. You can also just translate it, but I like the idea of me being able to point my spotlight at a specific location. Now, you've seen what happens when I move the manipulator. The spotlight follows it around. But watch what happens when I move the spotlight. Okay, the manipulator stays in the same place. But now my spotlight follows it around. So light direction, light intensity, light color, again, it's the same thing. We can add a little bit of color, a little bit of cool, a little bit of warm, depending on what we need. And again, if I want to get back to my default color, let's just drag left and right. All right, so the elephant in the room that we haven't talked about so far is, how do I change this cone? This is the shape that the spotlight is creating based on the opening on the end of it. Okay, these are the extra controls that the spotlight has. They're called cone angle, penumbra angle, and drop off. All right, so cone angle, this is the size of the cone. It's in degrees, and right now 40 degrees, it's not quite like a 45-degree angle. Sort of like this. 45 would be a little bit more like that, and we got 90, ouch, that's 90-ish right there. You get the idea. So that's the size. Penumbra angle, this is cone softness. And drop off, this is basically how even is the light in the cone. All right, let's take a look at what each one of these does. So right now, let's tackle cone angle first. Pretty simple. This is what my cone angle looks like at the default of 40. If I want to make it bigger, I just make it bigger, and notice it makes my circle or disk of light bigger. As I increase it towards the 180-degree mark, where it's actually going to be flat, now it just pretty much covers everything like a big flat disk. So this is how big the cone takes up. Now, that's the size of the cone that the spotlight is illuminating. The penumbra, that is the softness on the edge of the cone. So at 0, we've got a razor sharp spotlight edge. It's got nothing to do with shadows. So as I increase the penumbra to the right, notice it makes the cone a little bit bigger, but softens it. As I decrease it to the left, it goes negative. Now we're taking away from the cone and making it softer. Notice it's got nothing to do with the shadows. It's all about the edge of that cone. In reality, the cone is still here. But when we change the softness of it, we're making it bigger. It's getting softer. We make it smaller. The cone's still out here, but we're contracting and softening inward. So it depends on what your needs are. Are you confined to having your spotlight take up a certain area and then you want to soften it, but you find if you soften it going outward, it changes it? Well, then you go inward. Now the drop off, let's put this back to 0, the cone softness. Put that back to 0. The drop off right now, the spotlight is pretty even lighting, pretty even intensity through the whole cone. As I increase the drop off just a little bit, like I just twitch and it drops down, it looks like cone softness, but what we're really doing is we're keeping the center of interest, the area, bright, but it gradually gets less intense toward the edges. So honestly, this slider is really touchy. Like, Personally, I would just, sliders are usually pretty twitchy. I usually like to use just numbers. But you can just touch it and you're almost at 2. Now, between penumbra and drop off, you can make what looks like a fairly soft looking light. But the problem is our shadow has not changed. We still have a razor sharp shadow. So how do we change the shadow? Well, the same way we did the point light. Down under the Arnold rollout, down here at the bottom, we've got radius right here. All right, let me get rid of that. So we got radius, which behaves the same way. Notice as I increase the radius, my shadows soften up. How soft should they be? Well, it's going to be based on your reference. They're probably not going to be razor sharp. They're probably going to have some, some little bit of softness to the edge, makes it look natural. So between penumbra, which is cone softness, drop off, and radius, you can make a pretty soft looking spotlight. So when you start using penumbra and drop off together, it gets a little twitchy. So you got to kind of decide, do I just need a little bit of drop off, or because then it looks like it resets your cone. So it gets a little twitchy between the two, but you get the idea. Now, with the spotlight, this adds in 3 new parts to your checklist. Right? So principles of light, quality of light. We got direction. Pretty simple. Where's the light coming from? We got intensity. How bright is it? These are standard to all lights. Light color, shadow quality, and spotlight only. Cone angle. How big is the cone? Number 6, cone softness. That's your penumbra. And 7, drop off. How even is the light in the cone? How even is light in cone? Now, you add these to your analysis when you're looking at reference. So let me go back to, not here, but over here. So when we're looking at these lights, we're still dealing with the principles of light, right? Direction. Okay, where's the light coming from? From the side, from the back. Intensity. Color, if there is any. Shadow quality. Now, get all these first. Don't worry about the cone. Don't worry about the cone softness. Get the direction of the light first. If you get the shadows correctly, the cone is just a matter of getting the right size. People obsess about trying to get the cone before they get the shadows. Get the shadows first. Get the intensity, get the color, get the shadow quality. If your shadows are correct and match the reference, then you resize the cone. All right, then you get the cone softness. That's penumbra. Does it go soft? Does it look like it softens inward? Does it look like it softens outward? And then is it even? Does it look like it's brighter in the center and get less intense toward the edges? Well, that's going to be drop off. So for a spotlight, you've got 7 things. You've added 3 to your normal checklist. But only after you get the first 4. Does that make sense? Because you can drive yourself crazy trying to do it out of order. Questions? Jasmine's good. Thank you. All right, no questions? Dia, you good? Diamond's good. Allegra? Damien, you good? You fixed it. What was it? Okay, so we've got that. The last light that we're going to take a look at real quick is going to be the directional light. That acts like the sun. So right now, this is a disposable scene. I'm not going to save it anymore. So let's just delete that. And let's go up and create a directional light under Create Lights. Down here, we want to go directional light. Now, when I start it up, you'll notice that the leftmost sphere is illuminated immediately. So you can say, all right, well, you know, your light is inside the geometry. All right, so I pull it out. I move it around. It doesn't change. That's because the light rays are parallel. Right now, they are breezing over the top of my ground plane here. So what's going on is these light rays are not aimed down, they're parallel. Now, with parallel light rays, you'll notice that no matter how I translate it, it doesn't change. That's because think of it as an infinite wall of light being broadcast in the direction of those arrows. Now, scaling the icon, that's only going to change basically how large it is in your scene. Again, good for adjusting if you've got a small scene or a big scene and the light's too big or the light's too small to see. But really, the directional light is all about rotation, just like the sun. So now when I rotate it around, now I've got some of the other spheres visible. My ground plane only is visible because I've got some light bouncing off of it. But watch what happens when I aim my arrows down. Now, some of those light rays are hitting the table. So when it's aimed full down, that's kind of like the sun at noon. You're getting all of the light rays hitting the surface, and that's probably the brightest. Notice as my shadows get longer, the scene gets a little darker because less of those parallel light rays are hitting the objects in the scene. Now, the sun has fairly sharp shadows most of the time. There's only one other setting that we need to do really for our sun, and that's under the Arnold rollout, and that is called angle. As the angle of the sun changes, the shadows get a little softer in nature. So the angle that we usually plug in for the sun is 0.5. Now watch what happens when I plug in 0.5. So this is at 0. Actually, let me give this a little more intensity. There we go. You notice the sun doesn't take a lot of intensity to get it to be really bright, unlike the other lights. It's kind of coated in with more intensity. But here are my default shadows. Watch what happens when I increase my angle to like 0.5. My shadows get slightly soft on the edges. Now, as the shadows get longer, they get a little softer on the edges. Right here. That behaves a lot like our sun does. Now, as I increase the angle, yes, I can make them softer, but that doesn't really look that natural. So honestly, if you make the angle 0.5, that's a pretty good average for the sun at almost any time of the day. Now, artistically, yeah, you can add more softness in there if your reference calls for it. But, you know, a good place to start is with how the sun behaves in real life. So even when it's directly overhead, there's just ever so slightly softened shadow. Just ever so slightly. But the shadow softness gets much more noticeable the longer it gets. All right, so same thing, color. You can go in, add it in, you add warm, you add cool. Depends on what you need. All right, any questions about the directional light? Everybody good? Okay.
So, but you said that on an overcast day, shadows are blurry.
That's because there's no direct sunlight, so you wouldn't have a directional light. You'd be using another kind of light. When we get into environments, you'll see what that light is. It's called a dome light. We don't use dome lights now because they're not really a basic light. They are more of an advanced light. We also get into other lights like a mesh light, which we can take any piece of geometry. I could take the table, I could take a wall, I could take a book, I can make it into a light, which works really well in an environment because a lot of times you've got light bulbs that are modeled, or you've got fixtures in the ceiling that are modeled. If they're modeled accurately, well, you just select them, make them into a mesh, and then you're done. Now, the one thing I didn't get into, which I forgot in the area light, let me backtrack just ever so slightly. Let's turn the area light on. In the area light, you can also change the shape of the light, but it really doesn't change the quality of the light. So let me keep this, let me delete this. All right, so the one thing I forgot in the area light was the light shape by default is a quad, which is four-sided area light. Typical. You can also make it a disc. Now, is there an actual difference between the light? Ever so slightly on the shadows. Just ever so slightly. It's more about the shape of the light that's visible than it is about the quality. You could probably get that same effect by making that square area light a little bit smaller or a little bit bigger. Now, there is another one called cylinder, which is kind of silly because it's a hollow cylinder and it creates a void in there unless you turn it sideways. And honestly, I don't show cylinder just because when we get into mesh lights, you just take an object that's a cylinder, turn it into a mesh light, like say fluorescent lights or not. Yeah, fluorescent lights would work. I'm thinking more of like neon lights where you've got sign writing and designs. You could model that, turn them into a mesh light, and they'll behave just like they would in the real world. All right, so let's take a quick look at the workflow for project 2. And to do this, I'm going to demo the front light or the top light for the directional light, because that one's a fairly quick one to get. So I'm just going to discard that scene. Remember, you always want to start by setting your project. So I'm going to set my project. Lesson 2, SAL, where it's project 2, SAL Arnold, and then there's the Maya project folder. Going to hit set, file open. I'm going to open up the area directional point light scene. All right, now, don't forget by default, every piece of geometry in here, going to go to the perspective, because I like to work in perspective, but render from the render cam, so I can see where my lights are. So if I select all my geometry here, I've got all the geometry in the group plus the small bowl that everything's in. And I'm going to assign an AI standard surface. What's the shortcut key for that? Close, not command. Nope. Shift, yes. Shift T. Just remember, SAL is shifty. So assign new material, Arnold shader, Arnold standard surface. And first thing you want to do, turn off specular weight. Specular weight goes to 0. Second, take your base color value to 0.5. That makes it 50% gray. So let's go in and take a look. Look how dark that looks. Immediately, you should say to yourself, oh, I better check color management. It shouldn't look that dark. So Windows, settings, preferences, color management. Sure enough, it's off. Turn it on, hit save. Once you enable it, it will save with the scene file. Color management is scene specific, or if you're starting a brand new scene from scratch, Maya remembers to turn it on. So now color management's on. I've got my AI standard surface, specular weights off, diffuse color value is 0.5. Next, always check your renderer. Go into your render settings and see what is set to render. Oh, look, somebody set it for Maya. Bad, don't do that. Change it to Arnold. Now everybody's happy. So my scene is set up. I'm going to save. Why? Because it's Maya. Maya hates humans. It will crash. It will bring heartache and misery and laugh at you the whole time. All right, save. Notice they're MB files, so keep them as MB files. Don't try and change them back to MAs, because the student version of Maya doesn't necessarily like that. It's liable to go, oh, I can't save it because there's nodes in here. I don't know what to do with. Color management. Remember, color management, that's in your checklist in the instructions. Right here. Right underneath assign the material. Verify color management's on. You want to do that with every scene anybody gives you, as a matter of fact. Now, some of our stuff, color management's turned on, like project 1, it was on for you guys already. Project 2, it's off. Project 3, I'll be honest, it could be on, it could be off. But check, please. All right, now, I am ready to rock and roll here. So what I'm going to do is let's open up my Arnold render view and let's bring the reference in. Gaia, another cue is if color management's off and you forget and go to bring an image in, a reference image into the Arnold render view, it'll look way too dark. So if you see that, go, oh, okay, it's probably color management. So let's go reference. Do I want to do that one or that one? All right, well, you know what? Let's do top. So here's my reference. So this is a directional light. So I'm choosing to do top here. That means I need to do front here. If I do front here, I do top here, but I'm going to do top. And let's go create a directional light. And if I hit render, this is perspective. I want to render from the render cam. And honestly, I can't see anything. Why? Well, that's because this bowl that we've got the objects in, it's kind of like Stonehenge in a bowl for breakfast. Notice we can see in, but you can't see out. Ooh, scary. That's because it's single-sided. It's designed so the camera can see in, which makes it very simple. But right now, our directional light is an infinite wall of light being blocked by this bowl. So what do I have to do? Well, let's rotate it because that's what the directional light works by. So says top light, looks like the shadows are pretty neatly underneath my objects. Well, that should tell me something right there. Let's just keep moving this until they're roughly underneath. Now, it looks like it's underneath in the center here, but look at these pegs in the back. Not quite. Still not quite. You know what? Instead of rotating this, I'm going to go into the channel box. Well, let's try 88. What's that look like? Oh, definitely not enough. How about 89? Is that better? Nope. Let's try 90. Is it really that simple? Yeah, it's pretty darn close. Yeah, how about that? All right, so top light directly aimed down. So my light direction is okay. It's, look, I don't see much in the way of a wobble in shadows. So I'm pretty happy with that, but the intensity, it looks like it needs to be a little brighter. So I don't know, let's go 2. How's that look? Still looks a little dark. Also, I've got color in my light. Let me crank this up a little. That feels a little better. Now let's add some color in and see how close we can get with this. Now I'm looking at my shadows. Yeah, let's go with the color. All right, so, okay, what is that? Does that look like it's red? No, definitely not red when it's definitely not that saturated. That's more pink. So that's more towards cyan or more towards magenta here. Let's try that. Always keep your value up, turn your saturation down. Pretty close. Still looks like it could be a little brighter. That back wall looks a little dark. All right, well, let's crank it up. Let's try 4. Now it looks too bright. Dang it, Maya. So what I'm trying to do is match the intensity on the ground. I'm looking at a couple different areas, looking at the back wall, the ground, the tops of my blocks. The shadows, they look pretty hard. Can't tell. Let me see what that looks like if I bump my angle up to 0.5. Look any better? Looks a little better. So now I've got this kind of done. So light direction, light intensity, light color, shadow quality. You know, I might have gotten away with keeping my directional light angle at 0, but just that little touch of softness on the edges just adds a little more mellowness to it. So I would render this out again. Obviously changing my render settings to production quality, and I would also make sure you include the denoiser. Remember, the workflow you did for project 1 is the workflow you're going to use for the entire class. So your render settings and the post imager, you know, the denoise noise, that's going to be used through the whole thing. Right. Does the workflow make sense? Questions? So obviously, area light, just take your time. You're going to have to deal with a little more softness. For the point light, decide, do you want backlight? Do you want side light? And just make sure, you know, work progressively. Direction, intensity, color, shadow quality. If you have to go back, adjust the direction a little. We go through the checklist. All right. Any questions before we break for lunch? Questions? Damien, you good? You're good? Okay, go ahead.
So in this example, we saw the directional light coming in from above, but if we were to do the front one, how would we get shine visible?
Well, remember the directional light's all about rotation. So you would have to change the rotation of the light.
Yeah, but it wasn't able to get visible.
Okay, but see, your question has got to be based on what does my reference look like? So let's bring in the reference here. So there's my front light.
Oh, is it not coming? Okay, I see. So it's from above and front.
Well, it's got to, because the sun, if we're talking about the sun's going to be above always. I mean, honestly, even when the sun is parallel to the ground plane, it's still above us because it's so big. So in this case, basically, you're going to deal with adjusting your shadows. Now, if you adjust them too much, watch what happens to the corners. If you start to see this, you're going too far. Shadows are too long. Shadows are too long, that means the sun's got to be aimed down a little bit more. So now it's just all about, okay, now I got to rotate it a little more to the left. So you hold your breath, or you go into the channel box and you do like one, either Y, X, Y, or Z, whichever one you're rotating. I always like to kind of fine tune that. So right now they're a little bit long, so I'd have to adjust the Y axis a little bit. And honestly, at this point, I'm going to like either hold my breath when I go to rotate it, or I'm just going to go into the channel box and go, okay, where is that? Which one am I rotating? Now it's saying I'm rotating more than one, but that's not really true. Still a little off. And obviously, I would get rid of the color too. But it's pretty close. So remember, it's all about your reference. Try to not go with preconceived notions. Okay, it's in front. It's got to be directly in front. A lot of times, front means it is in the front, but it's also raised up a little bit to get the shadows to look good. Because if you stick something directly in the front, you can't see the shadows, so then you lose a sense of depth. Normally it's offset just a little. That makes sense? Good. Diamond, any questions? Daya, you good? Damien? Area light, it's all about light direction. Yep. Area light, the rotation of the light's not going to be as big a deal as, is it higher, is it lower, is it left, is it right? Once your area light is sort of aimed in the right direction, it's all about my shadow's too long. Well, I got to raise the light up. It makes them shorter. If I lower the light, it makes the shadows longer. So just take your phone and you can get the same result. Like, I don't know if you can see it here. If you stand up, you probably can. But as my light gets lower, my shadows get longer. As the light comes higher, my shadows get shorter. And all I'm doing is basically just raising and lowering the light. Well, I'm trying to also keep it aimed at the subject. But I could do this too, which is basically just what an area light is. Okay. How about out there in the zoomosphere? Any questions? All right, Jasmine said, for rendering, do we change the render? Yes, Jasmine. The render settings are going to be the same as project 1. So, just because we're dealing with simpler geometry and, a single light source, you're still going to be doing the same level of quality. Now, your render times are going to be a whole lot less because you've only got one light and you've got simple geometry. So your render times will probably be around a minute or 2. Because honestly, when I rendered these out, they were pretty low quality, but what was my render time? Yeah, it was like 6 seconds. So if I crank this up to production quality, it's probably going to be like 20 seconds. And with the render, the denoiser, it's probably another 2 seconds. So you're probably looking about 20, 30 seconds, maybe less. I'm also streaming, recording, and rendering at the same time. So my Mac is a lot more taxed than yours will be. All right, good question. Any others? All right, so I'm going to stop recording.